Hello everyone, this is Shankho and welcome to part 5 of the Java interview series. So in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the important topics in Spring that you might be asked in a Java interview. So the first question is, describe the front controller architecture for Spring MVC. Now, when we are thinking of appearing for a Java interview, we must be aware, or we must be really familiar with the architectures and design patterns that are used in Spring. And Spring MVC architecture is definitely one of them that we should be aware of, and we should be, really well versed with. So let's take a look at the Spring MVC architecture. So the Spring MVC architecture looks something like this, where we have the HTTP request coming in, and every HTTP request is intercepted by a dispatcher servlet. So dispatcher servlet works as a front controller in a Spring MVC architecture, and then the dispatcher servlet goes to the handler mapping or the handler mapper. Now the handler mapper decides which controller the request should go to. So inside each controller we have the controller methods, which are responsible for serving a request, which are associated with requests, and where each of them are responsible for serving a particular request, right? So the handler mapper decides which controller the request should go to, and then from there we go to the controller. So the controller might be in turn calling the service layer, and the service layer might be going to the DAO layer, the data access object layer, and the DAO layer in turn goes to some database or some data store from where the data is fetched, and then back to the controller, and then we have the view resolver. So a view is basically a page that can be rendered on the screen, that can be shown to the user, that is a user interface, and can be shown to the user. So there might be cases where we won't need, where our controller won't be, or our service or a request won't be taking us to a view. We might be needing to return some JSON response or some XML response or whatever. So every time it is not the case that we would want to show a page, or we would want to take the user to a particular view. So if there's a view associated with the request, then it will be resolved by the view resolver, and then again the dispatcher servlet would fetch that view and then render it on the screen and show it to the user. And if there's no view associated with the request, if suppose we want to return a JSON response body for the request, then there's no role of this view resolver and view, and the dispatcher servlet would be simply sending the JSON body response body or the XML response body to the user. And that is basically how the Spring MVC architecture looks, and this is how it works, right? So next up we have the important annotations. So there are a few important annotations that we must be aware of before attending a Java interview. So some of them I have listed here. At the rate AutoWire. So AutoWire, what does it do? It injects dependency of a particular type into a variable, right? So let's take a look at how this works. So I just close all these, and then I've already created a project called demo, and I'll just delete all these. Right, and let's take a look at the dependencies for this project. So in this project we just have the Spring Core dependencies. We don't have any fancy stuff inside this project. So we just have Spring Boot Starter test and dev tools for dependencies. And what I'm going to do is open this up, remove this as well. Great. And what I would do is I'd create an interface inside this package com.demo, and I would name it person, right? And I would create two classes. So first up, we'd have student, which implements person, right? And next up, we'd have a class called teacher, which implements person, right? Let's say finish, and then let's say component. Right? And let's have a toString method for this class. So I would say generate toString. Okay. And here I would return teacher. Right? And inside the demo application class, I would say @. So we are looking at this annotation, right? @AutoWire. So, and what is the purpose, or what is the utility of this annotation? It injects dependency of a particular type into a variable. So here we'll see how it does that, right? AutoWire, and let's say private teacher TEACH here, right? And let's here just print, all right? So not here, let's say @bean public void test, and I would just print teacher, right? Now let's run this as a Spring Boot app and see how it behaves. Go to console. Okay, so we can see we have teacher printed here. This is because this variable has an object of teacher injected into it. So that is how AutoWire injects a dependency, or injects an object of a particular class or a particular type into a variable, right? And next up, we have the annotation called component, right? So we have already used this, and what does it? What is the significance of this annotation? It is used to tell Spring to register a bean of the class. So what we have done here is we have marked this class as component. So what we are doing is we are essentially telling Spring to create a bean of the teacher class when the application context is loaded or when the application context is initialized, right? So we are creating a bean of the teacher class with the help of this annotation called component, right? And then we have @bean. So what does this annotation do? It is used to manually create bean of a class for which the source code is not accessible and the class is not already inside the Spring container, right? So let's take a look at how this works. So if we say for this class we have we have a bean created with the help of this annotation called component, right? But for student class we don't have a bean created. Now let's suppose we want to inject student object into this, right? An object of student class into this. Sorry, student, right? And inside the student class, let's generate the toString method. And let's return student from this, right? And now let's try to run this. So we have an error here, right? And what does it say? Field teacher in the demo application required a bean of type the demo.student that could not be found. This is because we are creating a bean of this class called teacher, but we don't have a bean of this class called student. And here what we are trying to do is we are trying to inject a type which is of student into this variable called teacher, right? But we don't have a bean for this student class, right? So suppose this was a class for which we didn't have access to the source code. So how do we create an object of this class for which we don't have access to the source code? Suppose this class has been this class is added as a jar in our build path of the project. So how do we create a bean of this class, student class? So we can do it with the help of @bean, right? And what I'm going to say, let's say public student create student bean, right? And I would say return new student, right? Now let's try to run this again and see what happens. So this time our application doesn't fail and we have student as our output, right? This is because instead of marking this class as a component, we have created a bean using this method create student bean, and this method has @bean annotated on top of it, right? So we are creating we are telling Spring to create a bean of this of student of type student when the application context is getting loaded. So we can create a bean using @component. We can create a bean using @bean, right? So these are the various ways in which we can create beans in Spring. And next up we have qualifier. So what is the utility of qualifier? It is used to specify the name of a bean for dependency injection when more than one beans qualify for dependency injection, right? So suppose we have okay, so let's now have instead of student or instead of teacher. So both student and teacher are of type person, right? So here we are specifically telling Spring to inject a type which is student. But what if we tell Spring to inject a type which is person? they should still be correct, and they should not give us a compilation error, right? Because both student and teacher are of type person, and we can inject a person type into this teacher field, right? And I'll just change the name of this field. I'll rename it to person, right? Right. Now let's try to run this. Okay, so instead of creating a bean here, I would say add the red component. So I just, right, I just mark this class as a component so that Spring creates a bean for this class, and I would run this again as a Spring Boot app. Okay, again our application field, and we have the description here as field person in demo application required a single bean but two were found, and they are student and teacher, right? So what happened here is we are trying to inject a type into this variable called person, which is of type person, but both student and teacher classes are of type person, right? Because they implement person. Both of these classes implement person, and we have beans of both of these classes in the application context, right? So Spring doesn't know which object or which bean we are trying to inject into, or which dependency we are trying to inject into this particular variable, right? So that is why it throws an exception, or it fails, right? So we can resolve this with this qualifier, and we can specify the name of the bean that we are looking to inject into this variable. So we'd say student here, right? And we'd run this again. So now we have a student injected into person variable, right? If we had teacher here, it would inject teacher into this variable, right? So that is how we can have a qualifier if there are more than one beans that qualify for dependency injection. So this is a way of telling Spring that when there are more than one beans that qualify for dependency injection for this particular type, we want this particular bean to be injected into this variable, right? And next up we have primary. So primary, what is a utility used to specify the object of a class as primary choice for dependency injection when more than one beans qualify for dependency injection, right? So this also works in a similar way as qualifier does. So if we have more than one beans that qualify for dependency injection, we can have one of them annotated or marked as primary, and Spring would know that if there are more than one beans, or if there are multiple beans that qualify for dependency injection, then the one that is marked as primary should be injected into the variable. So I'll just remove this, right, and say I'll mark this as primary. So I say primary, right, and I run this again. So we have student injected into this variable called person, right? And we have another line here. What does it say? Qualifier is given higher precedence when both primary and qualifier are present. So let's have qualifier as well. We already have a class marked as primary, which is student. I want to say @qualifier, and I'm gonna have teacher as the bean name inside qualifier, right? I'm gonna run this again. So this time we have teacher as we have a bean of type teacher injected into person, right? That is because qualifier is given high precedence to primary, right? So these are the important annotations that we need to know, or that we need to be aware of before attending a Java interview. There are other annotations as well, such as @profile, @value, @depends on, @scope. So those are important as well, and they also need to be, you need to know those as well before attending a Java interview. So I already have a video where I talk about the various important annotations in Spring, and I have explained each of them with examples, and I'll put the link for the video in the description below. You can check that out. And next up, we have types of dependency injection. So we have dependency injection by type and dependency injection by name. So I think we have seen both of them, at least one of them. So suppose if I remove this, and if I remove this, you're again gonna get an error, right? Runtime error. So let's run this. Okay, so we again have two qualifying beans, but Spring doesn't know which bean needs to be injected into person, right? Now what if we tell that we want a type of student that needs to be injected into person? So now Spring knows that it has to inject student into this variable, right? So it injects student. So this is injection by type. Now let's suppose we have person, and instead of having this as person, we name this as teacher, right? We rename this variable to teacher. And even now we have two beans that qualify for dependency injection, and we haven't told Spring using either @primary or qualifier which bean it needs to inject into this variable called teacher, right? So let's see what happens. Okay, this time we have teacher injected. We don't get an error, a runtime error, and we have teacher injected into this variable because despite the fact that we have two qualifying beans, we are telling Spring to inject a bean which is called teacher because we have the variable name which matches the name of the bean, right? So each bean is associated with a bean ID and bean name, right? So if that bean name matches with the variable into which we are trying to inject the dependency, then we are telling Spring that you should be injecting the dependency, or you should be injecting the bean which is named same as the variable. So that is called dependency injection by name, right? So we have seen dependency injection by name, we have seen dependency injection by type, and what are the various ways to inject dependency. So this is called field injection, right, where we auto-wire a particular field. So this is a field that we are auto-wiring. So instead of auto-wiring this, we could have had, say, public. We could have had a constructor demo application, and we'd say person teacher, right, and this dot teacher equals teacher, right, and we'd say @autowire, right? So let's see if this works or not. Let's run this and see if this works or not. So this seems to work, and we have teacher injected into this, right? So what we are doing here is we are essentially doing a constructor injection. So the constructor is a parameterized constructor, and it takes in this this variable called teacher, which is of type person, and we have annotated this constructor, or we have marked this constructor as auto-wired. So the variable that it takes in, or the parameter that it takes in, has to be injected, or has to be Spring is supposed to inject a dependency into this parameter that it takes in, and that is exactly what it is doing, and this is called constructor injection, right? Now next, instead of constructor injection, let's do something like generate getters and setters and select all. Okay, so we mark this as not wired, right? And let's see if this works or not. So we again have a teacher injected into this field, right? So what we are doing here is, instead of having a constructor as auto-wired, we are having the setter as auto-wired for this field. So we have getter and setter for this field, and we are saying this setter should be injected with this input parameter. So the value of this input parameter should be injected by string, or this input parameter should be injected with a bean by string. So this is called setter injection. So these are the various ways in which we can inject dependencies into a particular field, or into a particular variable of a particular type. And next up, we have the bean scopes, right? So we have singleton bean scope, we have prototype bean scope, we have request bean scope session, global session bean scopes. So we need to know about each and every bean scope in Spring, and we need to know how they work to be able to attend an interview in Java. So we should be very thorough with each and every bean scope and what they exactly mean. And next up, we have difference between singleton class in Java and singleton scope in singleton bean scope in Spring. So when we say a singleton class in Java, that essentially means that there cannot be more than one object of that particular class in the memory, right? But when we are saying a bean to be of singleton scope, what it means is, it means okay, so for each bean we have a bean ID, right? So when we say a bean is of singleton type, it essentially means that a bean with a particular ID can be attached or can be associated with only one object, and it cannot be associated with more or any more object. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the class for which we have the object is a singleton class. So let's suppose we have a bean called, say, we have a bean with ID teacher, right? So when we are asking Spring to fetch us an object using this bean ID called teacher, it will always fetch us the same object. It won't fetch us a different object every time, right? If the bean scope is of singleton type. But that necessarily doesn't mean the class teacher itself is singleton. The class teacher itself may not be singleton, and if there is another bean ID, say teacher1, which also has an object of the teacher class attached to it. So that is possible. That means that for a particular bean ID, we can have only one object associated with that bean ID, and we can have another bean ID attached to to another object of the same class, right? Because the class itself is not singleton. And I have a whole video where I talk about the difference between singleton scope in string and singleton class in Java, and I'll put the link in the description below, and I've explained each of them with examples, elaborate examples, so that would make the understanding of this much easier, and I'll put the link for that in the description below, and you can check out that video. And yeah, that's all for this video, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video. And as always, if you're not already subscribed, please do subscribe, and part 6 will be coming soon. Thanks for watching.